Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Create a Life You Love, the podcast, where we dive deep into the stories of individuals who have forged unique paths in life and business. I'm your host, Jeremy, and today we have a truly special episode for you. In this session, we're joined by Suneel, an extraordinary thinker, writer, and storyteller whose journey from the fast-paced world of entrepreneurship to embracing a life of purpose and meaning is nothing short of inspiring. Suneel's story is a testament to the power of aligning with one's Dharma, a concept he eloquently captures in his books, Everyday Dharma. Throughout this episode, Suneel will share his profound insights on living a life that balances inner fulfillment with external achievements, the transformative nature of habits, and the delicate dance between force and trust in our personal and professional lives. So sit back, relax, and prepare to be inspired as we embark on this journey with Suneel, exploring the depths of what it truly means to find your path and embrace your purpose in both life and business.
It's great to be here. I'm doing great. Yeah, it's been a beautiful day out here, and I got up and did a little bit of Tai Chi this morning on the beach, and I'm just starting to get into that. It's a new practice for me, but I love it because I sort of compartmentalize breath and movement, and I find that Tai Chi kind of brings these two things together in a really, really interesting way. So I literally one day was walking and I saw a group doing it, and I joined the group, and I've been doing it ever since. And that was last Thanksgiving. So it's beautiful. It's a beautiful practice.
Okay, so it's not that new. Last Thanksgiving, assuming you're in the States, so but 6 months or so. Um,
Yes,
where exactly are you located?
I'm in Manhattan Beach, which is right outside of Los Angeles.
Oh, okay. Oh, amazing. Awesome. So as far as like who you are, right? Because I don't know if a lot of people, maybe some people be familiar, but I think it'd be a good idea just to kind of kick things off and give a little bit of like an overview of who you are, what kind of work you do, and what your intentions are kind of with the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, yeah. So, I'm a full-time writer now. I host a documentary series that you can stream on Roku as well, where I fly around the world and I meet interesting people who I think are living what I call your Dharma. They're bringing sort of their essential self into the world and doing that in really interesting ways. And I've been sort of blessed. I think it's kind of like almost like Anthony Bourdain for sort of purpose, and a lot of the people that I cover are entrepreneurs, small businesses that where you find owners who really sort of put themselves out there in a really interesting way. And I love the work. We're about to go into season 3. And then when I'm not on the road shooting the show, I write. I've written 2 books, one of which is going to be coming out this September. It's called Everyday Dharma. The last book that I wrote was a little bit different. It was called Backable. But the common theme amongst these 2 books is, now, how do we take these things that we have inside of us, what my grandfather and my ancestors used to call your dharma or your essence, and how do we express that into the world? That's what I'm obsessed with, and so I love my work, but I also feel like it's the kind of thing that I approach more from the point of view of a student than an expert. Like I have gone through many times in my life where I felt like I didn't know what my dharma was, and I always had to sort of find my way back to the center, to the core. And so I find myself out there trying to figure things out selfishly for my own self, and then taking what I learn and sharing that with people who are going through what I'm going through.
Okay, that's beautiful. And I do want to get more into the book because I think it's a real good representation, like you said, of the work you do and the work
Yeah.
you're doing moving forward. But maybe we can pull it back a little bit, understand like some of the instances in your life where maybe you had an inception point or a moment in your life where something happened to you and you decided you needed to have kind of that shift in your own life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think like a lot of people, I spent a good chunk of my career chasing what I now sort of think about as outer success, status, wealth, achievement. I wanted to sort of be respected by my peers. I wanted to have money in the bank. And the sort of turning point for me was, interestingly, that I started two companies, both of which did not work, failed. Then I started a third company, which actually did. And I expected when that third company, was successful, when it sold, and I finally did have money in the bank, and I was being asked to come on to CNBC and speak at conferences, that all of a sudden that was going to make me feel, really great. And it did, for about a couple of weeks. And then I sort of slid back to the same sort of feeling of emptiness and sort of kind of desire that I felt before. And for me, that was sort of one of those moments where I was like, "Oh my gosh, if this can't make this feeling of emptiness that I have go away, then what actually is going to do that?" And when I was young, when I would take trips out to New Delhi to go see my grandfather, he would teach me about this concept of Dharma. Right? We all have an essence. We all have something about us. And Dharma is not what you do, it's who you are, right? And it's how who you are gets expressed through what you do. And what I realized in these moments was that I had spent really kind of these past 15 years of my career really focusing on what I do, right? And how that looks to others, how that manifests in terms of success. But I had spent very little time sort of thinking about how who I really am can be expressed through what I do. And if I had to break it down in really, really simple terms, what it drew for me is sort of this distinction between outer success and inner success. Outer success is status, it's wealth, it's achievement. The inner success is, I think, meaning, it's purpose, it's joy. And the false belief that I think I had was that outer success is somehow going to lead me to inner success. If I
Well,
get enough,
right.
if I get enough of these achievements, if I get enough of the success, then eventually I'm going to start to feel whole inside. I realize that's not the case, and I don't think it's the case for most people. In fact, Dr. Tal Ben Shahar, he's a brilliant professor at Harvard University, where I'm on faculty, and I've had a chance to study his work as well. He calls this the arrival fallacy, which is that we all are sort of there's a huge temptation, and I think this is especially true in the West, to feel like we're going to reach this moment of arrival, and when we get to this moment of arrival, everything is going to feel okay, right? We're going to have accumulated enough money. We're going to have gotten enough success, enough achievement. And when we get to this point, all of a sudden, all of the things that we'd hoped to feel, we're going to feel in that moment, right? And then we're gonna keep feeling that way. But it's a fallacy, right? But we continue to chase it, though. If we kind of convince ourselves, hey, if we get that next deal, if we get that next car, if we get that next house, and what ends up happening is that we get it, we feel it temporarily, but then we're subject to what neuroscientists call hedonic adaptation, which is that as soon as we actually get that feeling of joy, we kind of slip back to a baseline and we go chasing the next thing. So I don't think that there's a way around the arrival fallacy necessarily. Like that is I think that is something that we're all sort of subject to sort of feel. But I think what we can do is we can reverse the flow. We can start with inner success. We can start with meaning. We can start with purpose. We can start with the things that make us happy, whether or not they end up manifesting in success, whether or not they end up manifesting in achievement. They inherently are things we enjoy doing. And while outer success, I don't think will lead to inner success, I think if you focus on inner success, you do the things that really, I think, express who you are in the world, then I think outer success inevitably follows.
I see. But do you think you had to go through what you went through to identify that in yourself?
It's a good question. I think if I would have sat myself down and I would have 20 years ago, and I would have said, "Hey, listen, these things you're chasing, they're not necessarily worth it." I don't know if I would have listened to myself.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know. I would like to say that I would, but maybe not. And looking back, all the clues and all the signs were there. It was getting promoted, for example, and working in a consulting firm that I didn't like. I didn't like the work. I didn't enjoy what I was doing. And I remember even in my early 20s getting promoted and feeling a little bit sad. And I couldn't tell why. I'm like, wow, am I just like ungrateful for, this nice thing that has happened? And I think that what I now know is that like it was my body. It was my sense of Dharma that was telling me, hey, listen, being promoted can sometimes advance you in the wrong direction. It can
Right.
actually advance you further away from who you really are.
So how did you know then? Like when you, well, looking back on it, you probably didn't know in the moment, but now when you look back on it, how did you know that you were not heading in the right direction? And then in return, how did you end up making that shift to saying, you know what, it sounds like you were doing well, you were getting promoted, you ended up starting these other businesses, and one of them became very successful. How did you
Yeah.
realize, identify in yourself though, that like it wasn't the right direction? And then what did you do kind of to move forward?
Yeah, and it didn't happen in sort of a big moment. I didn't I guess a switch did not flip necessarily for me where I said, "Hey, like everything is wrong." But I think it was a buildup. It was a feeling of like, my gosh, like I'm getting more and more of what I want, and it's not making me feel any better. I think the sort of that the buildup all, came to this moment where I started this company that worked, where I felt like, all right, all this work that I've been doing is now going to pay off. I'm going to feel this lasting sense of joy, and I didn't. And I think that was the moment where I said, I'm climbing the wrong hill here. Like
Right.
something has to change. I have too many years left in my life, too many years left in my career, ideally, right? Where I want to spend it in a way that feels more fulfilling. I don't know if this path that I'm going to take, that I'm going to shift to, which this path I call the path of Dharma, of focusing on inner success, focusing on what makes me happy, is going to result in as much of the outside wealth, resources, all of that stuff. I don't know. But what I do know for a fact is that on a daily basis, if I can follow that, if I can stay true to who I am, if I can focus on expressing who I am through what I do, I'm going to feel so much happier on a day-to-day basis. And that's what I wanted. And years ago I decided that somehow, some way that's what I was going to do.
Right. It's interesting because you said when you were a little kid, I believe it was your grandfather, he would
Yeah.
talk to you about Dharma and he would kind of like instill this stuff in your mind. But I guess somewhere along the line, you still had these goals of these, to get these achievements, to create this type of, the idea of success that you thought was going to bring you happiness. Right.
Yeah. 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 I mean, being sort of an Indian kid growing up in America, I always felt sort of torn between these two different sides of me.
Okay.
I would go to temple, or I go back to India and spend time with my grandfather, and I would learn concepts like Dharma. And the crux, I think, of what I learned was this idea of, in some ways, r- you know letting it go, right? Like trusting that the universe in some way is guiding you in the right direction. But then as soon as like the temple doors would swing open and I go back into like American culture, it was like, take charge. Yeah, anything you want, nothing comes without you really sort of gritting it out and hustling hard. And I felt torn. There were two, I think, fundamentally sort of, at that time I saw different points of view. I don't see it that way anymore. I think that there is a way for this to be sort of a yes and. Gandhi, I think, is a really good example of this. He would sort of talk to his followers about this balance of force and trust, right? And if you're all trust, you're just sitting back and doing nothing and kind of hoping that things are going to happen for you. That's probably not the right way to go. And that's not why he was effective in what he did. But if you're all force and no trust, then you could be grinding and you could be gritting and you could be hustling and just burning yourself to the ground and
Putting yourself
realize,
out.
like,
Right. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's this balance of, I think, tuning in
Hmm.
and seeing kind of which way things are sort of heading, tuning into yourself, realizing what is feeling right, what is not feeling right. I think it's also in realizing that failure can sometimes be our greatest teacher,
Right. Yes.
right? It's in sort of, when things don't go your way, are you like pounding the pavement quickly and saying like, let me get back up and let me go do this again? Or are you taking some time to really, I think, soak in all of the learning that comes from a failed experience, right? From every mistake, from every mishap, the golden sort of insights that come from that. And one of my favorite concepts, Eastern concepts, is the concept of kintsugi. And kintsugi is, it's the act of golden repair, and it came from art, where there was an emperor in the 15th century who shattered his favorite mug, and he sent it to an artist, and the artist, instead of trying to sort of staple the pieces back together, applied this like golden lacquer, where now the king got his mug back, but there was like, there were literally traces of gold that outlined all the shatters, all of the breaks,
All
and
right.
it became this art form that turned into a philosophy of really, I think, celebrating the wounds, because it's through the wounds where we get the best learning. It's through these experiences that teach us the most. I mean, look, like I said, I started three companies, and two of them failed.
Right.
The one that worked ended up paying the bills, and I'm not gonna like say, oh, that wasn't worth it, because it really was. I mean, my wife and I were in a pretty bad state at that time. Like, I remember going to the ATM machine and being like, oh no, like we're pretty much like we're running on fumes here. And so it came at a good time when I had the exit, and I'm not going to be ungrateful for that. But I can objectively say now that if I look at who I am and where I learned the most about what I love, and where I learned the most about sort of the way the world works, and how I like to lead, and it all of that, I'd say the vast majority of those learnings came from the two failures, not from the one win.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to end that kind of segment, because I think a lot of times everything is almost in perfect synchronicity, like our whole entire lives. And I've been going through this kind of reflection phase where I've been looking back at my own life and looking at all these like areas of my life where I went through a lot of trauma, or a lot of like, areas where I had a lot of problems in my life when I was younger. And back then I looked at it as like, why are these things all happening to me? But now I look at it, it's almost like it was in perfect synchronicity to
Yeah.
bring me to where I am now. And I had to learn those lessons and understand like how I had to feel in those certain situations so that I can take that and hopefully bring it out into the world and find my own purpose. And now when I look back on it, it all makes perfect sense. Like
Yeah.
all those like experiences that I honestly had to go through, it was almost like the universe, like as much as I tried to, it would try to push me in a certain direction, but as much as I tried to force myself and go in another direction, it always somehow would be bringing me back. And,
Yeah.
and in a weird way, it sounds like you're kind of saying the same thing. Like you were trying so hard to create these businesses and get some success out of it,
Yeah.
but you still were left with that feeling. And the universe was almost like, no, 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 you can do this and get some success, but it's not going to fulfill you. It's almost like pushing you back on track, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like in your latest endeavor, and maybe you can talk about where you're at now, and are you getting that, I guess, fulfillment that you were kind of missing before when you were creating these other businesses and projects and so on?
Yeah. I mean, before I got serious about, profession and career, this will sound weird to you, but I loved speech writing. I loved writing speeches. I started to understand what speech writing meant from my social studies teacher, Mrs. Knauer, in the seventh grade. Yeah, still remember she wheeled in one of those sort of television sets, and she played for us the Martin Luther King address. The I have a the classic I have a dream speech. And I remember just being so captivated by that. And I remember asking her, like, hey, like, how does somebody come up with like that? Like, how does that all come together? And I remember her telling me like he had help. He had people who work with him on that type of thing as well. And that's where I first sort of learned the term speechwriter. And I remember thinking to myself, I want to be a speechwriter. And I literally would write speeches for friends. If you had a birthday party, you had a bar mitzvah, like I was your guy. Like I would write speeches for you. And I loved it. And as I grew older, I started doing internships with members of Congress. I moved to Washington, D.C., did an internship out there. But 2007, the iPhone launches, and all of a sudden, it seems like everybody I know who is ambitious is moving out to Silicon Valley to be a part of that, to be part of tech. And I didn't want to get left behind. So I ended up deciding that like I would move there. And that's what started my entrepreneurial journey. But the reason I bring this up is because there's always been an essence, for me, and I believe there's an essence in everybody, where if you look at sort of even the moments of your life that you did not enjoy, there will probably be little bright spots of things that you actually did enjoy, right? So for me as an entrepreneur, I did not like running teams. I did not like, that process. I did not like sort of the hustle and grind of iterating on product after product. I know people who love that and are so good at it, and that you can tell like that is their dharma, that is their essence. For me, I found it intellectually interesting, but it never lit me on fire, right? The way that it did them. But the one thing that did was the stories.
Hmm.
Every time I would get a customer story back, and as entrepreneurs, we don't have a lot of data, right? So what we focus mainly on is like the stories we're hearing from our customers. The third company I started was called Rise, and what we did was one-on-one health coaching. And literally what I would pour over, what would fill me up was just like reading the stories from our customers that were coming in about like the lives that were changing, even just from losing 10 pounds and being able to now sort of, not be on the sidelines, but be like on the field with their kids. Those stories would sort of fill me up, and it kind of made me realize that, gosh, that's the same thing. That's the same essence that made me fall in love with speech writing.
Yes.
Was the essence that made me fall in love with hearing these customer stories. Even though I wasn't directly playing with my dharma, there was a through line that was forming.
Got it.
There's a saying that like you can run from your dharma, but you cannot hide. It's going to find you. It's going to be a part of you. You are going to be connected in some way. The question for you really is, are you going to sort of clear the paths? Are you going to clear the tunnel to be
Right.
more connected to it? Or is it going to be this voice inside of you that just calls from you when you're sleeping at night, or when you're completely exhausted? And so, for me, it's all about, all right, how do I then take this what I now call storytelling, like storytelling at its core, and how do I start expressing that in different ways? And when I started to really get clear about like that's my essence, I love to tell stories. Then I could start to think about, all right, what are the different ways that I can clearly express that to the world? I started to write those down. I could start a podcast like you have. I could
Mhm.
write books. I could teach, right? The list went on and on. And now all of a sudden, this like explosion of creative possibilities came to mind.
Yeah, that's amazing. And again, going back to what you're saying about the essence and how I was talking about that whole thing about synchronicity is like I like I'll use myself as an example because I felt like over the years I've felt that essence, but I've been pushing it aside, right? Or pushing it down. Not I think pushing it down is a better analogy, right?
Yeah.
You're suppressing it. No, like my whole thing was I wanted to help people. I wanted to support people in their own journey and hopefully share my own experiences so they can transform, right? But this and little things have been showing up over the years, but again, I was pushing it away, pushing it away. So what do you like in your own experience? What do you tell people? Like, because I'm sure a lot of people go through that. They feel like they have a calling to do something, but
Yeah.
no, I'm already doing this. That's not who I am. I'm
Yeah.
not going to like stop all this to start something brand new. What do you tell people to kind of I don't know, like to tap into their dharma? Like how do
Yeah.
people start that process?
Yeah. I think that, number one, we might find that we don't have to make wholesale changes in our life necessarily in order to start living our dharma, right? It,
Okay.
it is important. It is important, I think, number one, to kind of make a distinction between what you do and who you are, because sometimes we can confuse dharma for occupation, right?
Right.
Dharma is I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. I think dharma is something deeper than that. Doctor and lawyer, those are expressions, right? We have an essence and we have an expression. And it's important to sort of keep those two, I think, separate. So one thing that I encourage anybody to do when they're thinking about their own Dharma and reconnecting to that place is, number one, to realize that that's already inside of you. You don't need to go looking for it. It's already inside of you. Number two, to realize that it's deeper than the form of an occupation, right? It requires a little bit of digging. And my ancestors called this sort of this digging, this process of going back to your authentic self, sukha, right? Sukha is your authentic state. It's who you are. And it's kind of like Michelangelo, if you've ever heard sort of how he would think about sculptures. He would look at a block of marble and he would say, the sculpture's already inside, right? I don't need to add anything. What I need to do is I need to start chiseling away the layers. And
Exactly. That's
right. And that's kind of the work. That's more of the work of Dharma. So oftentimes people will sort of go on a journey, on an exploration, looking for their Dharma on the outside. And travel and adventure, all of those things can, I think, give us insights. There's nothing wrong with it. But I think ultimately what we're looking for is already inside of us. Right. And so
right.
what we need to do is we need to chisel away those layers. And in my upcoming book, I talk about sort of my four favorite chisels, the four
Okay.
things that really
That's
sort of help me. So, the number one is the bright spots chisel, right? And the bright spots chisel is really, if you are unhappy with what's happening in your life right now, what are the bright spots? What are the moments, even in the
good.
darkness? What are
Okay.
the moments of darkness that you actually do enjoy? Because miserable experiences can actually teach us a lot about who we are, right? They can teach us a lot about what we don't want. But
Good.
interestingly enough, if you look at sort of these moments of joy that you're experiencing even in the darkness, that can sometimes be the purest signal of what it is that you actually want, right? Of what you want to do more and more of, right? That can be a very, very clear sign to your dharma. So that's number one, is your bright spots. Number two is what I call your sort of your possibility chisel, right? And the possibility chisel is, once you actually start to understand a little bit more about what those bright spots are, you start to kind of list out what these possibilities are, right? Like what are the ways that you can actually start to express this essence. So like I said, for me, when I started to kind of realize that it was storytelling that was really my essence, all these possibilities started to come up. Podcasting, teaching, speaking, writing, all these different possibilities, right? And the key is to really just be open at that point in time, right? Instead of trying to grab one and saying, all right, I'm going to run with that,
Right.
when you're sort of in this chisel phase, really just try to stay open to kind of what's coming up for you, right? And one of the best ways I find to stay open is through what I call the magazine aisle walk, which is literally taking a walk down a well-stocked aisle of magazines and just paying attention to which magazines are like really grabbing your interest,
That's
right?
it.
Genuinely grabbing your interest, right? Like, not because you felt like you should read it, right? But because like you genuinely want to. Like when I'm in a magazine aisle, sometimes I feel like I should grab the Harvard Business Review, right? But the truth is, I don't like love reading the Harvard Business Review, right? So I've got to stay true to what it is that like really grabs me, and for me, when I took the magazine aisle walk, one of the things that I realized was the philosophy was really grabbing me, which is very different, right? I mean, I'd spent my career working in tech and entrepreneurship, and all of a sudden I'm finding myself like grabbing, articles and reading articles by people like Ram Dass and Maria Popova and Ryan Holiday, and loving that, devouring them in ways that I would not devour anything related to sort of ROI or business metrics or anything like that. So that told me a lot about myself, right? That told me a lot about my essence. The third chisel is what I call the Dharma deck chisel, which is, as these ideas are started coming to you, now you can start to kind of like start to think about prioritizing. But there's a tricky balance here, because you don't want to choose something too quickly, right? You want to, I think, cultivate it. And one of the ways I do that is by, every time some like expression comes up for me, like whether it be podcasting or it would be writing, I would write it down on an index card. And I'd write the idea down on an index card. And every few weeks or so, I would take this pack of index cards that I was starting to accumulate, these ideas, and I would sort them from top to bottom. the top the top with the ideas that grab me the most, the bottom are the ones that grab me the idea the least. And what you'll find is that if you keep going and you keep adding these sort of cards to your deck every time something really kind of grabs you, you might notice that one or two cards sort of retain their spot at the top of the pack, right? And everything in that deck is probably something that is related to your essence in some way, but the one or two cards on top are the ones that are probably grabbing you the most, right? And you really want to tune in and pay attention to those. Then the fourth chisel is, what I call the Picasso chisel, the Picasso chisel. And the reason I call it Picasso chisel is because there's this great quote from Picasso, which is that the meaning of life is to find your gift and the purpose of life is to give it away. And I love that because it really is about sort of turning to what is it that you would do if you weren't compensated, right? What is it that you would actually give away? And that's
Right.
not to say it's not to say that you would work for free, right? I mean, we have bills to pay with the realities of life. But I think one thing I've realized about money is that it can sometimes, I think, dilute your thinking when it comes to what is my dharma. And so it's not to say you shouldn't worry about money, but when it comes to sort of really tapping back into your essence, it is worth going through the exercise of what is it that I would do for free? Because I think if you can answer that question, right, then all of a sudden you get a very clear angle into what your essence is. Then you can start getting into the practicalities of, well, how do I get paid for it? How do I start to move into a direction which is actually going to make me live, a decent life doing what it is that I love to do?
Yeah, and I love how you just said that, doing what it is you love to do, or creating a life that you truly love. And one of the things that you said that stuck with me was the whole idea of essence versus expression, and that when you tap into your essence, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to stop everything you're doing and all of a sudden start something new, right? And I think what you're saying as well is like when you tap into that essence, you can bring it into everything that you're already doing. It's just
Yeah.
a different way of being. Is that aligned with what you're saying?
100%, 100%. Because, I think like, we get frustrated. I have found myself frustrated to the point where, I felt like I needed to just blow everything up, right? Blow up my entire career and go in a completely different direction. What I realized is that not necessarily,
Yeah.
like there were quite a few things that when I really took a step back and started tapping back into what my essence was, I started to realize, oh my gosh, it is playing out in ways today, right? I just want to be doing more of that. So for example, I really loved pitching investors. I loved it. I loved getting into rooms with investors and pitching them on what we were trying to build. I know other entrepreneurs that hated that. They dreaded that part of the process, but I actually really loved it. Why? Because it allowed me to tell stories. The
That's what I was
company,
thinking, because there's
yeah,
synchronicity there between you telling stories and also the speech writing, right? And now you've tapped into, it's a great example.
exactly. I mean, like I still remember one of the first investors that decided to actually back my last startup, Rise. I remember being in the room and realizing that they were just like completely checked out. They're completely tuned out. And I was in one of those moments where I was like, do I just kind of fold up and sort of realize that this meeting is going to be a dud, or do I change course? And this was, you know, this moment where I said, why don't I just tell these guys what it is, like why I'm actually doing this, right? Because I'd been focused up until that point in time on all the metrics, what the market size was, what the numbers would look like. And I was like, well, why don't I just back up a little bit and just tell them a little bit about why I'm creating this business. And so I told them the story of my dad and about how my dad, when he was in his 40s, had an emergency bypass surgery. He was rushed to the hospital. Oh, we almost lost him that day. And I remember, I was about 11 years old. And I remember going to the hospital and just feeling like he was a completely different person. He looked like he'd aged 20 years. And I remember the drive back home a few days later. And what I remember most, though, is that they gave us a piece of paper, the hospital, basically saying, here's the new life you should live. You need to be eating things like broccoli and Brussels sprouts. You need to be doing certain levels of exercise. And I remember thinking to myself, my gosh, like this is a completely different lifestyle than my dad has been living. And is he realistically going to change all
Right.
that now? Right? Is that going to happen? And the answer was no, he didn't. And the vast majority of people do not. But after being readmitted to the hospital, we were lucky enough where insurance kicked in. We were living in the Detroit area at the time, and the University of Michigan Hospital assigned us a health coach, where this person was going to now really pay attention, really tune into my dad's way of living, and start to customize these little habits that he could start to bring into his life. So, for example, we ate Indian food, and this health coach really studied like what the Indian diet was, and really started to learn how like we could start to cultivate little recipes and little things that we could do. We started to create little habits for exercise, even if it was just taking a walk around the block after a meal, like little things. And it was through these tiny habits that my dad's life completely turned around. I mean, this was the 1990s when he had this emergency surgery. I remember doctors sort of saying like, "Hey, maybe he's got like 10 years to live." It's been 30 years, right? And these tiny habits have kept him alive. I talked to him today. He walked 3 miles today, right? And it's all because of that. So I remember being in the room with these investors and just telling them that story. And all of a sudden, I was no longer in like business pitch mode, looking at slides, showing graphs. I was just telling them a story. And I came alive in a new way because that's what I love to do. And because I came alive in the room, all of a sudden I saw them put away their phones. They weren't checking their watches anymore. They kind of leaned
That's
in
so
a different
cool.
way.
Right.
They became the first investors to back the company.
Oh man, that's a great story. And you were so dialed into your essence and really coming from your authentic self. And in that moment, it all kind of connected.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I want to touch on something because you brought up habits, and I did want to get to it eventually, but it was cool the way that it kind of showed up when you're talking about how your dad, you went for this bypass surgery, and then he had to change his whole life, and it was the habits, even the small little ones that he had to change. You know, because of that surgery. And then as I was doing kind of the research on you, one of the things that I noted was like you've helped thousands of people build better habits for life and work. So I guess two-part question, like, is a lot of that work you've done on habits because of that experience with your dad? And also, how important do you feel like your daily habits, if you will, or your behaviors are a reflection of kind of like your essence and how you're showing up?
Hmm. Such great questions. The answer to number one is absolutely. Like
Yeah.
the reason that I am so fixated on the power of habit is because I saw it work for my father. I saw I
Mhm.
saw him change his entire life around. I, you know, I believe that seeing my dad, it's interesting, Jeremy, because oftentimes when we see inspiring stories, we think of people who have reached the very top, right? People who have sort of like climbed their way to the pinnacle of something. My dad went from, you know, I think nearly losing his life to what I would call sort of an average, like average health, right? So he didn't go from average to top, he went from below to average. And to date, there has never been anything that has inspired me more than watching his journey, right? And watching sort of how he was able to turn his life around. If I believe today that anything is possible, it's because I watched him. It's because I watched what he was able to do for his own health. Um, and it
Did
was
you,
habits. It
like,
was,
sorry, as you were growing up, you said, I think you were 11 at the time.
yeah.
So as you were growing up, was this instilled in you, or is this something that you're realizing now, kind of looking back?
Realizing now I wasn't mature enough at that point in
Right.
time to understand really what was happening. I remember being inspired at that age, or I should actually just say I was surprised because I really, I remember thinking to myself, like, this is kind of it for him. Like, I don't know if he's going to be able to have the discipline to really kind of turn his life around, right? Bypass surgery is a little more common today than they were back then. Back then, it was a big operation. It was a big thing, and I remember the hospital making a big deal out of it. I remember our family making a huge deal out of it, and I remember just as a kid thinking, yeah, he's kind of sunsetting his life now, right? But to watch him sort of come back into his own, to kind of turn that around, was surprising to me. And that surprise, I think, eventually inspired me. Now I look back on that and I realize the amount of work and dedication, but also I think that the habits that he was able to sort of bring into his life. I mean, look, he didn't become, we were not vegetarian. We ate meat at home and we ate carbs and we ate all that. All that stayed. Like he didn't become a vegan or he didn't do paleo or anything like that, but it was these tiny sort of little things. So for example, he worked very hard. Both my parents were engineers at Ford Motor Company. They had a pretty long commute, and they would commute from sort of outer Detroit back to our suburban home in Michigan. And by the time they got home, it was already sort of 6:30ish, right?
Yeah.
And so they would get ready, get changed. And by the time we ate, actually really sat down to eat, it's probably like 7:30. So
Mhm.
we're having like a pretty heavy meal at that point in time, because they were famished. They'd eaten lunch like around noon. 7.5 hours had passed by. They're famished, and he would have a big, heavy meal, then probably go to bed around 9:30, right? So maybe about an hour to digest in between, and not enough, right? So one simple habit that he ended up bringing into his life is that we would start making these sort of non-fat milk lassis. And if you're familiar with like an Indian lassi, it's like a
Okay, I think so.
yogurt-based drink, and we
Yeah.
would always have those in the fridge. And we put in a little salt, pepper, make it taste a little better. But it was like not sugary, but it was super healthy. And as soon as my dad would come through the door at 6:30, he'd pound a glass of lassi, right? Like it was the first thing he did, right? But now all of a sudden he's not that hungry. He sat down about an hour later to eat a dinner, but now it was a light dinner, right? And then he would take a walk around the block, right? So literally just the two habits that he changed was he had a glass of lassi before after he came in the door, and he took a walk around the block after dinner was over when we could,
Right.
when it wasn't freezing or snowing in Michigan. He'd take a walk around the block.
Nice.
Those those two, I would argue that those two simple habits may have added decades onto his life, right? Not months, not years, but decades onto his life.
That's
And
really cool.
that's the power of habit.
Yeah. So bringing it back now to like other people who may be going on this journey in their life, right? And they're feeling that essence, or maybe not feeling it. Maybe they want to tap into it and they want to peel off the layers. So as someone's going through that, obviously you're going to be reflecting on your habits, right? What habits am I doing well? What habits can I keep? Or what habits do I need to get rid of that may be interfering with my trajectory, or the place that I want to go and tap into that essence? But where does that all kind of fit into the picture? Because like again, for myself, I spent years paying attention to my habits, and I felt like, okay, I need to integrate. Let's use the morning routine as an example. All these successful entrepreneurs, everyone's talking about the morning routine. All right, let's get a morning routine. I got to exercise. I got to do breath work. I got to meditate. I got to journal. I got to get an ice bath. Now I'm jumping in the ice bath every morning, right? And I
Yeah.
had this reflection point, I don't know, maybe about a month ago, where I realized that yes, all those things are good, but if they're not created with the right intention, that they're for you and for your well-being, then they can serve you well, but they can also be counterproductive. When I say that, I mean I was almost trying to create this new identity of myself to be viewed a certain way, right? And look at me, I'm doing all these things in the morning, I'm showing up as a more of an ego-driven thing versus something I was doing for my essence.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so I hope that makes sense. But
I've been there myself, like for a while, I remember trying to sort of maximize the number of minutes that I would meditate, right?
right,
And
right.
I started to kind of realize that like, well, why? Am I really doing that for my own well-being, or am I doing that for some other sort of motive that had nothing to do with my well-being? And I kind of started to realize that it was much more about ego than anything else, right? I wanted to kind of, I wanted this sort of show that I could sit down on a cushion and be there and be still, and it started to feel unhealthy after a while. I heard Ram Dass, a lecture from Ram Dass the other day, old lecture from like the 1970s, and he was like, after a while, I started to realize that actually the power of meditation was being able to not sit down for longer, but to sit down for even shorter periods of time, but to be able to get into that space,
Nice.
in a quicker, more efficient way, right? And that was something that you can kind of get through practice, and I very much identify with what you're saying. the phrase that I like to think about is, what is a high quality habit? What's a high
Okay.
quality habit? And I think there are certain dimensions of a high quality habit. Number one, I think, is what you just talked about, which is like it's coming from a genuine place. It's not coming from a place of wanting to beat out other people, right? But it's coming out from a place of like genuine, again, what I call inner success, right? It genuinely is sort of making you feel meaning, purpose, joy, the things that I think really light you up. Number two is, I think it's something that you want to keep doing over and over again, right? If I learned anything from running Rise, like, we literally tens of thousands of people came onto the platform to lose weight. We saw some succeed, we saw others not. The people who succeeded were the people who embraced habits that they actually wanted to keep going with. So people who wanted to lose weight but loved carbs, and their habit was to get rid of carbs from their diet, very, very rarely did they find any type of lasting success. They might have found some short-term success, but for the most part, what we found is that people who lost that weight ended up gaining it back again because it was too hard to maintain over time. But on the other hand, people who had, simple habits like, I'm going to drink 2 glasses of water before each meal, right?
Right.
That for some people, that could be an enjoyable habit. I remember seeing people like buying really cool water bottles and
Right.
putting flavors in their water, and electrolytes, and like there's can be some joy that can come with that. And that's one of those habits that, if you can put into place, you may never want to stop doing, right? Because you like it. And that, to me, is a high quality habit. A high quality habit, again, isn't something that you are like having to force yourself to do. It's something that you actually, really just desire to keep doing over and over again.
Right.
I was, I didn't mention this to you, but I was obese as a child. When my dad was unhealthy, so was I. And, we didn't eat very well at home. And by the time that I was 16, I was what the doctors called clinically obese. And I remember I went to a camp, a summer camp, and it wasn't for, weight loss. It was for writing. I love storytelling, and I loved writing, and I was at this camp, and I met this other kid at the camp. His name was Gene, and he was a wrestler in college, and he was in great shape. And I remember we were walking back from class one day. This is like on Lake Michigan. We're in Evanston, Illinois. And I told Gene, I told him something that I had never told my parents. I had never told a friend, but I told him I wanted to lose weight. And I remember he said to me, "Meet me outside tomorrow at 6 a.m." And so I did. And that morning we went for a run. It was the first time that I had ever gone running, like unforced, not for gym class. We went for a run together.
Okay.
And it hurt. It wasn't what I would call like delightful necessarily, but I was running with a friend. And there was something very meaningful and pleasurable about that experience. So I wanted to do it again. So literally the next morning, 6 a.m., we did it again. And then we did it again, and we did it again. And over the course of that few weeks at summer camp, and again, it wasn't a weight loss camp, it was a writing camp. Over the course of that camp, I ended up losing like 30 pounds. My parents came to pick me up. Parents came to pick me up in Evanston. Again, we lived in Detroit, and they came to pick me up. They couldn't. They were shocked. They were stunned. And the crazy thing is that during that time, I never weighed myself. I wasn't like stepping onto a scale every day.
Yeah, exactly.
I just I just I just liked the act of running with Gene. At the end of
Right.
the day, there was something about the scents outside. It was about the fresh air. It was about the 6 a.m. It was about the dawn. There was something really magical and mystical about that for me, that I just wanted to keep doing over and over again. That, I think, when you find that thing, whatever it is that you want to keep doing over and over again, that's a high quality habit.
Oh, I see. So there's also some kind of connection too to your emotions, I would imagine as well. Like that analogy of eating the pasta, maybe that person was also, the pasta was also a trigger for them, not a trigger, but like an outlet for them to deal with other emotions that maybe happened to them when they were younger or other experiences, right? You
I
feel
think
like
certainly there's certainly we certainly saw a lot of emotional eating. There's no doubt about
well,
that.
right. So I mean more about habits in general, how there's some kind of connection to like some kind of emotional connection, like even for myself, like trying to do all these things, create all these habits, right, to make myself maybe more seen, right, or maybe create this image for myself, which again, bringing it back to some kind of emotional connection. Because
Yes.
now I'm actually doing the same things now, but through I've been able to peel off some of those layers and realizing that I was doing it more from an ego place versus myself. It's kind of like let some of the weight off. I'm still doing the same things, but it's just
Yeah.
the pressure is different. It's not the same as it was. But now I've identified, okay, these are the habits that I actually enjoy doing. They're making me feel healthy. They're giving me energy, right? They're helping my longevity, hopefully, as well,
For
right?
sure. For
I've
sure.
kind of alleviated some of that emotional baggage, if you will, that came from my past and all that of not being seen. So when I did that work, I was able to kind of let it go. And now it's just more just about serving myself.
I think that's right. I mean, I don't know who said this, but whoever did, it was brilliant, which is that, you know, character is how you behave when no one is watching.
Right. Yeah, I love that quote. Oh man,
Love
it's
that quote.
perfect. Yeah.
Love that quote. It-
And maybe it's difficult these days, just sorry, because of like social media, right? And it's like, oh, and again, I was
yeah,
falling into that trap. It's like, oh, I'm waking up early. Let everybody know. Oh, I'm jumping in an ice bath every day. Gotta let everybody know, right? And
totally.
again, it's like this weird line of like trying to inspire and motivate, get other people to do stuff versus also, are you doing it just, it's a funny thing these days, isn't it? Because like we want to share, we want to inspire, but also are we doing it to the point where we're just trying to be seen and we're doing it from a place that's ego driven? It's
I,
like,
I think that you're tapping into exactly, I think, the right dimension, which is just being aware of it.
mhm,
If you want to
right,
post on social media, no judgment there, but just being aware of why you're doing that, right?
yeah,
Is it, and I think there's nothing wrong with wanting to celebrate your work, right? To sort of be proud of yourself and to express that pride. I think that there's nothing. I wouldn't, I wouldn't see that as sort of negative. But I think, to your point about like, is it because you're trying to wear a certain identity? And I think that's where it can get a little bit dangerous, right? Because then all of a sudden, where you could be, I think, swept into, I think, all these things that don't really fit who you are, right? That don't actually match what you want. And I see it happen. I see that happen all the time. I particularly, I think, see that happen. We certainly see it happen in the health world, but more and more I see it happen in I think the world of work, right? Where it's like I don't necessarily like this job, but I do like the way people are reacting to it on LinkedIn.
all right, I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I do sort of like the idea that other people want this job.
Mhm.
Um, and so that to me is sort of, enough juice to keep sort of going. But I think that engine kind of runs out of gas.
Exactly. You're making up such amazing points, and they're relatable to myself just because, like I was saying, and I was even like going through this phase where I went on the Dr. Joe Dispenza like rabbit hole, right? And he talks a lot about visualization and
Yeah.
visualizing yourself in the future and stuff. When I was going through that, it's like, okay, so I should visualize this identity for myself. But if you don't know what your true essence is, in
Mm,
your case, the Dharma and stuff,
mm.
you could be creating this identity based on the wrong intentions, right? This materialistic intention, or like you're saying, like, oh, I like the way people are looking at me because I have these things, but it's not actually based on your true essence. So the real work is actually peeling off those layers, understanding more about your essence, and then maybe trying to understand that vision of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes
For sure. And I also think that, like, you know, one of the sort of, I think, the misconceptions I had when I studied Dispenza and I tried to square it with everything on Dharma, was that there almost seemed to be this dividing line of like, or this judgment of outer success, right? That if you want achievement, that if you want status, if you want wealth, that's bad. And what I realize is, no, that's not bad. We don't have to renounce, wanting nice things, or we don't have to renounce wanting to achieve big things. I think that can give us, I think, tremendous amounts of, I think, joy. I think and it can also sort of, I think, light us on fire in a different way. What I think that just I've realized is that that stuff, though, won't necessarily lead to the inner success. that we're looking for, right? The sense
Right.
of fulfillment, the sense of lasting joy, right? But if you can flip it, getting back to the dispenser thing, if you flip it and like you say, start with like that essence, then manifest it all, right? Like go visualize with the
Right.
with the
You
with the
still have to
big
get to the essence, right? You still have
get to
to,
the essence.
right. And I
Get to
think
the
that,
essence and then get to the essence and then visualize what the most dynamic, powerful way to express that to the world is, right? And I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Maybe that's you, I know we're starting out this podcast. Maybe it's you doing this podcast from, it's a top 5 podcast. It's making, lots and lots of money. It's doing, all the things you want it to do, but you started from a place of like, this is what I want to do.
right.
And if that stuff wasn't there, if
Yeah,
that stuff didn't happen, this would still be intrinsically rewarding for me.
100%. It already is, definitely. I feel that fulfillment. But I want to bring it back to you now, and kind of get to a conclusion here. So, where are you at now? Like you kept talking about Rise. So I could try to find information out about Rise. Is Rise still existing? Are you still doing that? And if not, like, what is your? I know you're writing your book and you do the podcast and you do all that stuff. But maybe just talk a little bit about the work you're doing now, how you're helping people,
Mhm.
and if people are interested in connecting with you as well. How can they do that?
Sure. Yeah. So Rise was sold in 2016. Uh,
Okay.
we sold it to a larger medical company called One Medical, which was then bought by Amazon. So Rise is still running, and it's owned and operated. It's in Amazon's world now. Um, yeah, and what I spend my time with now is it's almost entirely storytelling. And the way that I express that storytelling is through books. I express it through teaching. I'm on faculty at Harvard Medical School, and I express it through this show that I'm doing, where I travel around. It's like, as I
Right.
mentioned before, it's kind of like Anthony Bourdain for entrepreneurs. Really
So
set.
where is it? Where's that broadcast?
That's streaming on Roku, and
Okay.
I'll send you the link. So we're in season 3, and you can find season 2 on Roku. And I love all of it, but if I had to kind of break it down, it's really kind of simple. I gather stories and then I share stories, right?
Your
So I'm
storytelling.
I'm
Yeah.
constantly out there finding interesting stories and from all walks of life, right? I mean, not just people who are in the headlines, but I'm about to get on a flight to Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm about to go meet with a business owner who's running a small black-owned candle shop in Durham. And what they do is they design like these candles that have these very unique scents that are focused on real emotion, right? And if the way this owner sort of described to me is if you think of candles, you typically think of like French, European, expensive, white, right? They
Yeah.
wanted to do something that was very different than that. And it's a very small shop. It's literally like the size of like, a small office space, but they got this really cool sort of place where people in the community can come in and design and make their own candles, and they're flourishing inside this tiny community. And I find stories like that insanely inspiring, right? And then I'll go meet with somebody who is somebody you may like have read about in the headlines, right? And I like how these stories sort of
Yeah.
come together, and because I think the common denominator to all of it is Dharma, right? I think the thing that binds all this together,
Right. They found their essence. They found their
they
dharma.
found their essence. They found their essence, and in their own way, they are expressing that essence to the world.
How do you find these people? Like, how do you find the guy in North Carolina running the small shop?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the show, I work with producers. We're
They find,
constantly sort of on the lookout for what we think are really interesting stories,
yeah.
and we have to dig. I mean, if we only read the New York Times or read the Wall Street Journal, we wouldn't find these stories. But if we start digging into local NPR, all of a sudden we start hearing these things and say, "Wow, that's really cool, and that's really hidden." I think there's all sorts of hidden genius out there, and I think all we need to do is sometimes I think go beyond sort of the our normal sort of course of reading to find them. Yeah, and
Right.
I'm lucky enough to be surrounded by good people who have, I think, the same sort of, I think, zest, curiosity for these stories as I do.
Right. Yeah. I think social media and the internet, it's probably easier kind of tap into some of these markets and find these people. And again, I can relate even with this podcast. trying to find people that have these like transformational stories or experiences in their life where they're going in one direction and they realized wasn't fulfilling them. They had to pivot, do some work on themselves, go in another. And as I'm trying to find guests, I'm trying to figure out, well, where do I find these guests and stuff like that. So I can kind of relate a little bit to like this whole storytelling approach and trying to find these people. Hopefully, could you share these stories? The intention, I'm sure, is to inspire other people, right, to tap into their own Dharma
Yeah.
and maybe create something amazing in their own life.
Yeah.
So,
And then I think the good news is that, I mean, we are sort of at a point where we are all, I think, seeking to a certain degree. There are very few people that I have met, and I work with, all sorts of executives at top levels, and I work with people who are entering the workforce. And I think that there's this element of searching that I hadn't seen before over the past 10, 15 years that I've been sort of doing this work, is that I think we're all kind of now looking at a deeper level for a sense of fulfillment, right? And I think it's always been there. This would be a brilliant way for us, I think, to close, because I've been thinking about this a lot, which is that, I took a hike, I went on a trip, the border of Utah and Arizona, and this was a couple of years ago, and I was just starting to kind of like, really get into this book on Dharma. And I wanted to clear my head. And I ended up bonding with this guide out there. His name was Christian. And Christian was interesting because he used to work on Wall Street, but he went to take a trip to the Grand Canyon and he never left. He just decided to stay, quit his job, loved it so much that he became a guide. He rafted, he hiked, he helped other people, really sort of experience the wilderness in a different way. And he loved one of the things that Christian did for me, though, and I'll never forget it, is that we're in the middle of a hike and it was just the two of us, and he pulled me off to the side and he said, "I want to show you something." So we went a little bit off the trail, and he took me to this place where he had found all these little artifacts during his years of being out in that area of the country. Found these little artifacts, and he collected them, and he kind of removed one rock, and there was almost like this little shelf, and sitting on the shelf were these little things that people had made thousands of years ago. And sitting on this shelf were things like, cookingware, like little pots, but there was also spears for hunting, right? But then in addition to that, there were little pieces of art, right? Little pieces of pottery, little pieces of art. And I looked at all of it and I said, wow, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm looking at stuff that's literally like thousands of years old, like made by hand. And he said, no. You got to really appreciate something here. These people, they were being hunted, right? They were starving and they were being hunted. They had very, very low rates of survival, right? They were constantly on the run, and yet they somehow still had the time. They still somehow found a place to go make art, to go create pottery, to go express themselves in this different way. And the thing that I think that we are I think coming to realize is that wanting meaning in our life, wanting purpose in our life, sometimes it comes off as privileged, right? Like we should just feel so lucky to have a job, which we should, and to be able to earn a living and to be able to not have to starve, I think is something that not everybody can say. And there are plenty of people who don't have that luxury. But I think it's also important to recognize that this search for meaning and this search for purpose is not just privilege, but it's primal, right? It's something that's very, very deep within us. It's always been there, right? And this calling that you might be feeling right now, it's not something to tuck away. It's something that I think is at the level of hunger. It's at the level of all the other things that you're feeling right now. And the best thing that we can do for ourselves sometimes is literally just to listen, to tune back into what it's telling you, so that we can start to find little ways of expressing that into the world.
right. Or like you were saying, those four sorry, what did you
Four
call them?
chisels. The four chisels.
Four
Yeah.
chisels. Yeah, going back to those exercises, I thought they were really, really kind of easy to follow in a way, right? Like just kind of the good examples that you could follow to kind of chisel off those layers and figure out where you're coming from, where your essence is. So
Yeah.
when is that book coming out?
September 5th.
September 5th. Okay. And I guess
Yeah.
it'll be online, obviously, Amazon and all that.
Yeah, check out, you can go to my website. It's just suneelgupta.com. or you can follow me on Instagram at Suneel Gupta. And I'll be posting about it, and I'll be posting little insights from the book between now and then too.
Okay, yeah, I'll put all that stuff in the description. But thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing your insights and sharing your essence with us. I
Thanks,
mean,
Jeremy.
it's been an amazing story. I'm really appreciative of it. So, and yeah, I'll put all that information in the description. People can find you online.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And Jeremy, thanks for pulling this all together.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, take it easy. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.